Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode from the DJ Anesh series, bringing you the best in Southeast Asian history. Week upon week, we are totally independent, we are not a sponsored podcast. We are going strong and we are proud of that fact. KFC, please sponsor me. Welcome back to another episode. Are you guys excited that we are moving into phase 2? You can finally go out, meet your friends, your family. You can hang out in restaurants and cafes and all that kind of stuff. But I know deep in your heart right now, I know flowing through your bloodstreams right now, in your soul, all the way down to the core of who you are, all that things don't matter. All that matters is that finally, bubble tea is going to open again. I know. How many of you are laughing right now? I know that's what you all want, right? Everyone, the fact, right, that a minister or several ministers in their Facebook posts specifically identify that bubble tea shops are going to open. Man, that speaks something about Singapore society and what we prioritize and what we prize in our hearts, man. Today we're going to be discussing a lot about identity. In fact, we're going into the case study of Singapore, and I think last week I asked quite a number of you guys what constitutes the Singapore identity. I think I found the answer. So if the essay question comes out about what is the identity or what is the cultural force that is binding Singapore together, it is milk, tea, tapioca, and maybe sugar. Okay, that's all that is binding Singapore together right now. It is at our hearts. When we die, blood doesn't really matter. It's what the bubble tea is, the thing that flows out of our veins as we pass into the next world. That's what Singaporeans are all about, it seems. But I urge you guys to take your precautions. Go and get your bubble tea and stuff like that, sure. But if the queue is too long, just wait lah, huh? The bubble tea will be there for you next week. The bubble tea will be there for you in a month. The bubble tea will be there for you in a year. It will always be there, okay? Take your time. Don't need to rush into the queues and all that. It's a bad situation to be in. Being stuck in the queue for like 1-2 hours. And that's not good. That's not a good way to reopen the country, right? So, do take your precautions, enjoy your food and drink and all that, company with your friends and all that stuff. But please do so in a moderate way. Please ease yourself and pace yourself as you go forward from here. So, I guess that's a piece of good news to start off our podcast for today. Also, some connection to identity, what keeps us together, and things like that. Another thing about identity that I just read today, actually, that came out from the Straits Times was a report that it was a report from minority groups in Singapore. It was I think it's students actually. So they were looking at minority culture students in Singapore, and they were looking at, I guess the survey had some questions, and some of them had to do with the perceptions of minorities in schools. Minority students like kids in schools, and I think one of the results was that there was an increase of perceived prejudice against minority languages or somewhat of the like, something like that. In just basically what it translated, or what the findings were that minority students in school, they did feel a greater sense of their minority status, that greater sense of differentiation. I don't think I particularly mean it in a good way in this sense. I think the survey was more looking towards prejudice and discrimination and perceptions and things like that. So I think it hurts me to see something like this, because I don't know why. I can't account for the trends of that, going in school and everything. But yeah, as I was growing up, you guys know, half Chinese, half Punjabi, and the Punjabi side of me never really understood why, if you took Punjabi as a mother tongue or as a second language, you can't at that point in time you couldn't take it in school. You had to go to the language center to take all your tests and your exams, even down to the O levels and A levels, I guess, as well. So there was always that kind of very visible marker of difference, and I don't know if it's still in it like this right now. I can't say for sure, But back then, when I was a kid, I think I could see things like that. And I guess that is always going to be a perennial issue that Singaporeans will have to face. You guys will have to face it as well. RV is a school that has a lot of diversity actually. I get it that dominantly RVians are mostly from like Chinese community background, but there's so much diversity in RV that we have to deal with difference on a daily basis as well. It could be status, it could be personality, it could be background in the various forms that it has. And in a sense, RV, like many schools in Singapore, they serve as a microcosm of what Singapore is like. And today, one of the case studies that we are going to go into is Singapore, and the other one that we are going to go into is Burma. So these are two case studies that I selected for today's podcast. There's a reason for that. I'll explain later. But yeah, if we're all good and everything, let's get stuck in. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. So we are still going into the topic of national unity. This will be on the common test, one of the topics that potentially will be tested and have a question by itself. Going into the syllabus document, you've seen this already. Remember that our focus right now is three-pronged. We are looking at the overall assessment of each government or each country, looking at the level of effectiveness that they have achieved with national unity. So every government, every country has a national unity project, and largely speaking is going to occupy the whole of the country, it's going to occupy the government, it's going to occupy the people. So it's really a whole national project kind of thing. We're looking to measure effectiveness. In the supplement for last week's tutorial, I did give you all a consolidation of what are some of the national unity indicators that you can look out for and use in your essays. So when we say that national unity was achieved or not achieved, when we explain, when we argue, we want to use these indicators to evidence our stand, our points, and our arguments. So that's the first thing we're looking at, overall assessments of effectiveness. Then the next two things, we're actually looking at the two big categories of policies that governments usually tended to fall into. So the assimilationist approach as well as the integrationist approach. If you want more details on what these approaches are like, refer to last week's podcast, last week's tutorial discussion, and the consolidation handout as well. You can refer to your notes as well. There's more definitions and all that kind of stuff there. But today I think our focus is we really want to look into the case studies and to see how these kind of things played out. Now, the reason why I chose Singapore and Burma is because to me, these two countries, they represent the ends of the spectrum. For Singapore, we are really looking at quite a consistently multicultural integrationist approach. And that has been instituted since the inception of Singapore, 1965, all the way till like now lah. Like I don't think that has ever wavered in any large manner. So overall, on that one end of the spectrum, Singapore, integrationist, multiculturalist, I think that's the kind of approach that we've consistently had. Most of y'all who have grown up here, you would have been a product of that of sorts. I am a product of that, and in more ways than one. Later on, I'll show you that I am a product of a multiculturalist society. So that's for Singapore, and the outcomes we'll discuss later. Remember, I wanted y'all to get the understanding that integrationist policies doesn't automatically give you good outcomes. So we still have to make an assessment of Singapore, and we have to take a look at the range of outcomes over there. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, we are looking at the case study of Burma. And Burma represents a country that I think has consistently adopted an assimilationist approach. There may be high and low points towards how extreme their assimilation stance is, how extreme their policies were, but generally speaking, I think that dominantly they would fit under an assimilationist style approach. So they are at the other end of the spectrum. But again, with the questions that we had last week, I don't want you all to immediately equate assimilation to negative outcomes, because we still want to understand what happened in Burma and then we make our assessments from there. So the caution as I go into these two case studies, try not to make automatic outcomes, see the content as they are, and then try to make your assessments from there. So the first case study that we are going to go into is Singapore. I chose this because I think it's the most familiar to you guys, and yeah, I think it would be a good entry point into the case studies. Rojak, right? I'm sure many of y'all would know this dish. The idea of rojak is many different elements of food coming together, and you're just like melding them and mixing them together through like this black sweet sauce, and like just creating it into a fusion kind of dish, because there are many elements from different ethnic groups coming into rojak, and it's kind of like all coming together. Wow, this sounds like a master chef or like a Hell's Kitchen kind of podcast teaching how to make. So right now, you put 20 milliliters of the sweet soya sauce. You chop the pineapple, and then the all the other ingredients as well. The sesame seeds you pour sparingly over the rojak, and then you mix. You could give it a good mix of about 5 minutes and so, and then after that you present it in a dish, and then you make it look very nice, and then you take a photo, and then you post on Instagram, and then you can say that you are a chef lah. You stay at home and you cook, that kind of stuff. Okay, end of food podcast. Let's get into Singapore. Now, last week, what I did mention to you guys is that Southeast Asia, in many ways, is a product of what happened during the colonial period. And so, when independent Southeast Asian governments, when they took over, what happened is that they have to deal with the legacies of the colonial rule. They had to deal with the impact, they had to deal with the change that happened during colonial period, and then they had to inherit that kind of stuff. Last week I talked to you all about how the colonial powers, they set very fixed boundaries for what Southeast Asian nations look like. Right? There were fixed boundaries. This is my land, this is your land. There's a clear separation and that kind of stuff. On top of that, there were certain policies that were instituted within the country or within the colony that reinforce separation among peoples. So that's in just the two biggest things that come out of the colonial legacy in the social aspect, in terms of ethnic management, things like that. So we have to think about the legacy of immigration policies. Like what I said, there were certain policies that encouraged new peoples to come into Southeast Asia, and with the influx of these new peoples into Southeast Asia, we have a new dimension to the ethnicity and the diversity over here. These people are not native to Southeast Asia, but at the same time, many of them settle in Southeast Asia, various parts of Southeast Asia. And so there's that kind of ethnic management and ethnic demographics that all governments would eventually have to deal with as well. These immigrant populations, largely spearheaded by the Chinese community and by the Indian community, they come in large numbers. We're talking about thousands going to the hundreds of thousands, that kind of stuff. Across Southeast Asia, I'm sure it goes into its millions. So that's the kind of added load and volume that the Southeast Asian governments who inherit the country, they have to deal with. There's ethnic segregation on top of this, because not only are more and more people coming in, but the way that colonial powers, they organized the colony was to keep the different ethnicities separate. So you have a certain quarter that you stay in, and you more or less are confined to that quarter. Not by law lah, but your family is there, your friends are there, your community is there. You're more or less confined to that quarter. You can move around, but more or less you're there. And you may mix with other races, but only in a work setting. Like maybe you meet on the port as you are coolie labor, carrying like all the warehouse goods and whatnot. Maybe you like interact with other races in that setting, but not in a very genuine way, not in a very like deep way lah. At that point in time, it's only in a workplace kind of setting, that kind of stuff. So these kind of divide and rule policies were prevalent across Southeast Asia. In Singapore, you might know what the areas were like back then. So you have places like Chinatown and Telok Ayer, like more or less for the Chinese community, and then you have for the Indian community around the Little India area, and then after that you have Kampong Glam for the Malay community. the Europeans had their own like plot of land and like that kind of stuff. So it's quite separated lah, the different races. And this is what we call plural societies. I think I mentioned this in the last podcast. Now, things in terms of the demographics, as Singapore continued to have an open economy and more people came in and settled here and all that, it kind of changed the demographics of our country. And you can see over here in 1970, I think it's quite comparable to be honest, with what it is now. But you can see quite clearly the Chinese community, they dominate the population numbers, about 77%. Over here you can see you have the Malay community, 14%, the Indians about 7%, and others is 1.2. The framework that I'm using here is the official narrative, like the official framework that Singapore used back then, CMIO, which is C like Chinese, M Malays, I Indians, and O others. So that's the kind of framework that we have. It has its own problems in itself, but I'm not going to go into that today. But this is what the population kind of looks like. And I want you to put yourself in the government's position. And like many Southeast Asian countries, Singapore quite clearly has a dominant population in terms of numbers, right? Singapore quite clearly is a dominant population. And it is so easy. The tendency is there for you to base the nation on the dominant population. So it is very easy, hypothetically, it's very easy back then for governments to just base it on the dominant group, set the benchmark, and then everyone else kind of assimilates to that. Like, it's a very easy situation to be in. But clearly you know that Singapore didn't follow that path, and we adopted a multicultural integrationist approach. One of the key questions is, why? What made the government at that point in time, the PAP, why did they make that conscious effort, that conscious decision, those policies in order to pursue an integrationist path rather than something that is based upon the dominant majority population? So that's something for you to keep in mind, to consider. We'll probably discuss it in tutorials as well. So I don't want to assume anything, but in case you guys don't know what some of the ethnic groups look like, so let's start with a dominant group. Here we have the Chinese population, what Chinese people kind of look like. You can see they are vibrant. They are a vibrant bunch, right? And clearly very astute people, and all eager and brave in reaching out to life and things like that. Yeah, okay lah. I mean, I don't have to go through all the. I'm pretty sure you know all the ethnic groups, and they're all really friendly. Like, generally speaking, I think the Chinese community people, and also the Malays and the Indians and so on and so forth, they're all friendly people. Like, here's a face of friendliness that you see over here. I mean, what's not to like, right? When you see this face, and you're going to feel really warm and welcome, and that kind of stuff. As I mentioned earlier just now, I am a product of multiculturalism in a sense. You know that I have a lot of diversity within my family background. So this is my family. I thought I'd share with you all, like, at least you all can get a chance to see and stuff. Okay, let's see what kind of diversity I have with my family, how it cuts across. Yeah, okay, so my mom, she is Punjabi. So ethnically speaking, she's Punjabi. Her surname is Kaur, K-A-U-R. So that's a surname from the Punjabi ethnic group. And the males, the men, they would have the surname of Singh. So that's my mom's side. My dad's side, he's Chinese, and dialect wise, he's from the Hokkien speaking group. So that's the first layer of diversity, I guess. But I think it gets more complicated than that, because my mom, she's from the Punjabi ethnic group, but she speaks no word of Punjabi whatsoever. Like, she doesn't know a shit about Punjabi language. She can't speak it at all. Like, if I said something to her right now in Punjabi, she wouldn't know. That's because when she was growing up in the school education system, her parents made a conscious choice to set her mother tongue as Malay. So she learned Malay as a second language as she was growing up. So here we have a Punjabi lady studying Malay, knows nothing, not much about her culture, to be honest. And in fact, she knows a lot more about the Hokkien and the Malay culture than she does Punjabi. So that's kind of that layer of complexity, cultural complexity there. The other layer of cultural complexity is my dad, who comes from a very, very traditional Chinese family. They speak no word of English whatsoever. And so the transmission can go the other way as well, where you look at how my dad had to, and his brother, my uncle, they had to grow up learning English, and slowly but surely uh, they had to rebalance the languages, right? English and Chinese and Hokkien as well. So they became a child of two worlds in a sense, and they were going through a whole modernization phase back then in the 70s and the 80s. So that's my dad lah. So that's I guess the second layer of complexity. The third layer of cultural complexity, I think, is religion. Like, religion is a big part of culture, and religion is a big part of national identity, not just in Southeast Asia, but like everywhere else in the world. My dad, he is a Taoist. So he's from he practices Taoism. My mom, by right, I mean from an ethnic group, they are Sikhs, but she doesn't follow that faith. Instead, she follows my dad. So in a sense, she's a Taoist as well. So that's my mom. And then myself and my youngest brother, who is the third from the right, the two of us, we are Christians. So we kind of we went to church in secondary school, and then we converted and so on and so forth. So that is that side. And then my second brother, who is all the way to the left, he is kind of in the middle, where I think he follows the traditions of my parents, and I would say he's a Taoist, but at the same time he's a bit more flexible or liberal than that. So yeah, that's just by one family alone you can see such deep levels of complexity. And maybe my family is a good example of what Singapore is like, and what many other Southeast Asian nations are like as well. That kind of melting pot of many different cultures, and in a sense fusing it together. So this in a photo is rojak, right? We're kind of like all a mixture of like many different elements that are coming together to make a beautiful dish. So I encourage you guys to go back to your families, or you can talk to your friends or whoever, and just see what kind of diversity you have, besides ethnicity. There are many other things to uncover, and it can be pretty interesting. Okay, so one of the big things that conditioned why Singapore adopted an integrationist approach, why Singapore adopted a multicultural approach, is because of its history, especially of what happened in the post-war period. What happened in the 1950s, what happened in the 1960s. Now, you can read out about it, and actually you probably know a lot about it, having gone through NE and social studies as well. But I'm going to just highlight 2 points. The first point is that in that time period, there were a lot of ethnic clashes on the ground. And the ethnic clashes on the ground were quite escalated, and they were quite extreme in the sense that it involved active violence. And these are not mild events, and these are serious events that happen, and it happened across the period as well. Especially, I think there was a lot of animosity back then between the Malay groups and the Chinese groups. So there's that kind of ground sentiment over there, a lot of ethnic tension going on. So that's the first layer on the ground. Now, the second layer that I would like to add to that is what is happening at the elite level. So I'm looking at politicians, and back then the politicians across the causeway, the Singapore side, the Malaysian side, what happened is that there was a lot of race and ethnicity being brought up in their crosstalk. There was a lot of debate over it and things like that, and at times things got heated. In Malaysia, there were a group of politicians, what you call the ultras, and the ultras were really pushing racial politics to quite a different level. So that kind of escalated the whole thing at the elite level, but more crucially, what it did was that it escalated things at the ground level as well. So you have these two levels like coming together to produce a really evil and a really devastating kind of child lah, which is quite sad for that period of Singapore and Malaysian history. So a lot of what the government decided after that, as we moved into like independence from 1965, was conditioned by our historical experience. So the kind of policies that we crafted, the kind of integration that we pursued, the kind of multicultural framework that we had was all trying to be ethnic neutral. Ethnic neutral in this sense means that we do not, the government of Singapore, I have to stop using like first person. Okay, the government of Singapore sets up policies that dedicatedly does not discriminate, right? There's no active discrimination, there's no active prejudice in the ways that our policies are crafted. And saying that alone, it sets the benchmark. It kind of gives you the spirit of what our policies are like lah. But I think there's better ways to evidence it. There are more institutional things that we need to bring up in order to really give some hard evidence, some substantiation to what we're saying. The first thing over here, you guys would know this firsthand because you're kids in the Singapore education system. Achievement or selection and all that kind of stuff is based on merit. And so there's this idea of meritocracy. So meritocracy gives you this principle that it doesn't matter what kind of skin color you have, or doesn't matter what kind of cultural background you come from, or what people you are, and so on and so forth, but everyone has that equality of opportunity, right? Meritocracy doesn't mean equality. Meritocracy means giving you that equality of opportunity, regardless of your race, your religion, your gender, and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. You have that equal opportunity. What you make out of it is really entirely up to you lah. So what this does is that it prevents the discrimination of any one particular group. And with regards to meritocracy, you don't just see it in the education system, but you can even see it in other aspects of society, like the workforce. You can see it in even in terms of other aspects like university entrances, things like that. There are no like strict quotas or anything like that. It's just based on your merit, how well you do, and then so okay. I'm not here in GP. You can debate lah whether meritocracy is a good thing or not. I mean that's up to you. But over here, I just want to track the trajectory of how Singapore developed, what kind of policies it had, and what were some of the outcomes in terms of this social national unity dimension. So I'm looking at it specifically from that. If you want to do a general kind of assessment of meritocracy, that one, leave it for GP lah. It's not really for history and things like that. So as I mentioned, the legacy of the racial tension back in the 50s and the 60s, it really produced a lot of reflection and very dedicated policy crafting by the Singapore government back then. So one of the other things that is closely tied to meritocracy is multiculturalism. We take it for granted now. I think most Southeast Asian countries now, like in 2020, I think most of them pursue a multiculturalist approach. Some more than others, but I think more or less, we are there. But back then, it wasn't always like that. And so multiculturalism in itself could have been seen as an innovative idea to handle social dynamics. So multiculturalism, you should credit it, you should acknowledge it and award it for what it is. It's not something to be taken for granted or assume that it's naturally going to be there. It was a dedicated policy, a dedicated choice on how to govern the society and how to govern social relations between ethnic groups. So same thing like meritocracy, multiculturalism seeks to give an equal footing, status, fair, equal treatment, non-discriminatory across ethnic groups. As what integration policies call for, usually there's an accommodationist spirit. Usually it is conciliatory across the ethnic groups. Usually there's a lot of dialogue and understanding going on, and this is reinforced at the elite level, at the ground level, across time. And one of the key things about integrationist policies that I want you all to understand is that even though you allow ethnic unique qualities to be retained, like people can keep their special sense of identity, their unique sense of identity, even your majority or minority, doesn't matter, you can keep it, sure. But I want you to understand that integration seeks to move the nation towards also concurrently a national identity. So seeking to encompass all these unique identities, melding them together, and at the same time concurrently form this unique national identity and therefore national unity. So that's what the true spirit of integration seeks to do. It's not that everyone has their own separate unique identity. Okay, that's an important feature, but you're also trying to, bond and to kin the entire nation together. More evidence, as I said just now, we are looking into what is in our institutions, what is in our legislations, our law, our constitution, and things like that. What kind of policies that governments have successfully implemented and conceptualized. One of the things, I bet you all didn't know this. I'm not too sure. Like, if you ask me offhand, I can't recite this 5 for you, but so Singapore has a set of shared values. I think this came out sometime in the very, very late 80s, going into the 1990s. Shared values. So you can see over here, common set of 5 principles that all Singapore citizens, PRs, can subscribe to. Nation before community and self, family, basic unit of society, consensus, not conflict, community support, respect for the individual, racial and religious harmony. So I want you to see these 5 shared values. This is what I mean by ethnic neutral. All these things can apply to any ethnic group that you come from, any background that you come from. These are things that we are seeking to achieve as a collective whole, as a nation, things like that. It's not prejudicial, it's non-discriminatory, and it seeks to position and pride the nation, above everything. I'm 2000% sure that you know what this is. I hope you do, because like you say it like almost every day of your life. But hopefully after this slide, you would say the pledge in a different spirit. As you say the words, you might think about them more, you might reflect about them more, and see that they reflect everything that this society has developed and reached until to this point in June 2020. So the pledge, taking a look at it once again, I know we've said it 1,000 times, but let's really stare at it and look at it. We, citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people. So, that national, that nation kind of collective spirit, one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion. So here you see the integrationist element starting to come in. That inclusiveness across different ethnic groups and so on and so forth, coming together regardless of anything to build a democratic society. So that's our political structure. You can see elements of our political culture coming in to our pledge as well. To build a democratic society based on justice and equality. So take a look. The M&Ms come back already. Multiculturalism and meritocracy. All these are ethnic neutral as well. We are looking at supporting each and every citizen and PR here that we have to the best of our ability, and being colorblind to these kind of physical differences, so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation. Right? It ends off with nation, brings us all back, but also kind of gives us the sense that we are collectively building this country together. And that's something that the integrationist approach in its encapsulation you can see here in the pledge. So hopefully the next time you say the pledge, you might say it differently. It might be more reflective on your part, and you might see more things as you say the words every day. Now, there are other ways. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You can read all this yourself. It's in the notes as well. Other ways in which we have policies that showcase our ethnic neutral status, non-discrimination, non-prejudicial, and so on and so forth. So we have uh, things instituted in our language policy. You know that the national language of Singapore is Malay, and the official language of Singapore is English. So we have that national language to pay homage to, like, who we are, where we came from, that kind of stuff. The indigenous, in a sense, group of people, in Singapore, and that kind of position that they have over here, and how much they form the nucleus or the heart of what Singapore is. So we have that kind of element to that, but then official language wise use English. Again, it's ethnic neutral. We are having that common language that everyone can just converse and understand each other more through, which is English lah. So that's kind of like everyone has to learn English. So it's like everyone has to do that. English is not native to any of us, so that's something that all of us, regardless of race, have to learn. The other one is education. Again, I think this one you kind of know what it's like, and a lot of the curriculum in education reinforces that sense of multiculturalism. And the last one is even in housing. So there are certain quotas for ethnic dispersion within housing estates or even within blocks. So doesn't want the idea here is that you don't want a particular ethnic group to really crowd out a certain place or be concentrated too heavily in a certain place. Then it kind of it might encourage that kind of plural societies that were like in the colonial period, and certainly we don't want that to happen. So that's kind of thing over there. So presenting the Singapore case study over here and the kind of policy and approaches that we have, now I want you guys to go back to our national unity indicators. You can read more about Singapore in the notes, of course, and things like that, but at the end of the day, I want you all to see, judging by the national unity indicators, where does Singapore stand in relation to that? How effective was the government of Lee Kuan Yew? How effective was the government of Goh Chok Tong in enforcing and establishing national unity in Singapore? So that's the Singapore case, and from that end of the extreme, I'm now going to the other end of the spectrum where I look into the case study of Burma. Now you can see that the title here I put the Union. Actually back then Burma was called the Union of Burma, and from the name itself it already does suggest, because of this word union, right, it's like a collection of many different things, many different elements, many different components put together in a single unit, in a single entity. So as you can see from this map over here, Burma, like these boundaries that you see over here, right, is not a natural thing. You can see actually it's quite diverse and it's quite complex, and this doesn't look natural at all for a nation to be in existence with these kind of borders, like in this form like this. And that actually became the source of one of the core issues with Burmese attempts at national unity, with keeping the country together and things like that. Actually, it really, Burma is one of those countries that really suffered from both the colonial legacy and for unsound governmental planning and treatment of their peoples. So whenever I talk about Burma, I feel a tinge of sadness or like a tinge of forlorn, because Burma was that one country that many Southeast Asians and many countries across the world, they were kind of looking to, and at one point in time Burma was slated to be the leader of Southeast Asia because of the sheer amount of resources they had, because of the kind of leadership they had, because of the kind of connections they had. But because of many governance issues, history went the other way. One of the major problems that Burma had and Burma has right now is ethnic problems across the entire country. I did tell you the last time that Burma holds the record for the longest civil war in history in the world. And that's a record that I don't think any country wishes that they have. You can see over here ethnic dispersion. The Burmese group of people, they are quite concentrated in the center. They are the light green portion of people. And you can see across the entire perimeter, the periphery of the nation is where all our major ethnic groups are at. And actually that in itself, you can already start to tell that there might be some problems that are going to arise from this. Now guys, I want you all to keep in mind that another big difference between Singapore and Burma, or Singapore and any other country in Southeast Asia, is geographical size. So when you look at a country map like this Burmese map that you see over here, you can't think in Singapore terms. This map that you see over here, the geographical size of Burma is massive. So when I tell you that a group of people are concentrated in the center and kind of the minorities are at the perimeter or the periphery, I'm talking about huge geographical distances. I'm not talking about, hey, hello, I'm not talking about like between like Jukun and Pasir Ris. I'm not talking about that kind. That one is like we take MRT 1 hour you can reach already. This one is like sometimes you need days to travel, right? And that reinforces how difficult it is to really tie a nation together. In a case like Burma, most of it is separated by mountainous regions and very, very thick forests and jungles and river streams and so on and so forth. So a really, really difficult task. Later on, we'll go into the individual ethnic groups. The demographics in Burma, it looks something like this. Again, you can see there is a dominant population. The Burmese, okay, so there are many ways you can call this ethnic group. You can call them Burmese, you can call them Bama, you can call them Burman. Kind of like all same terms for the same group of people. 75%, you can see over here, 75% clearly dominant. And of course, this pie chart that I have over here is hugely condensed. I'm only looking at some of the major ethnic groups, the minority ethnic groups within the state. So the Karan, not Karen, so the Karan in green, the Mon in light blue, the Indians, it's the legacy of the British colonialism in purple. In darker blue. The Shan in red, the Chinese in purple, and the Kachin in sort of orange. So let's actually take a look at them. The minority group peoples. There's a lot of color. There is a lot of diversity. I mean, I purposely chose more positive looking images, and I'm quite aware of that because in another lesson I'll show you the more belligerent and more aggressive side of things. So anyway, here are the Karans, the Karan minority group of people. Oh, and again, keep in mind when I talk about Burma, when I say minority, right, it's not like in their hundreds. Minority groups can go into their thousands, sometimes the tens of thousands, going into the hundreds of thousands. We must remember that Burma is a huge country. So when I say minority groups, contextualize them to the country, it's not about what 10, 20, 100, it's not that kind. It can go into the thousands. So these are the Karans. You can see very, very rich in their own unique culture. These are the Shans. Same thing. Very rich in their culture and very distinct. Even among the minority groups, you can see many different elements. The Chin. You can see the Kachin over here. Again, very, very colorful. You can see the Mon. And then finally, you can see the Arakan. So the Arakan is, I mean, modern day, we usually refer to this ethnic group of people as the Rohingyas, but they are from Arakan state. So that's what the term that I'm going to use. So yeah, these are the minority groups across Burma, and there's a lot of diversity going on into there. And let's see how Burma deals with this. So same thing about colonial legacies, the boundaries. Like I said just now, it sets a very artificial boundary, and because of that, the nation that is born from that is quite awkward lah. In that sense, it is quite complex if you want all these separate entities to function as one single unit, one single nation. So the third point over there is what I call a center-periphery divide. So the center is where usually the capital is where usually the majority group people are. and the periphery is usually the outlying areas, the perimeter of the country, where usually the minority groups they reside. Usually there's not only a huge geographical distance between them, but there is also a huge political distance, there is a huge economic distance, and there is a huge cultural distance between these groups of people. It didn't help that under British rule, the minority groups were actually protected by the British in a sense. So it kind of reinforced a lot of tension and ill will towards ethnic relations, right from the colonial period and spilling over into the independent period as well. Now, there were attempts, definitely, even at the early stage, and I want to highlight the figure of Aung San over here. Now, Aung San is I think you can tell he's from the ethnic majority, but he was this unifying figure where even the minority groups could at least have some level of trust in him, some level of confidence and assurance that, in a sense, he was a man of his word, or he was in it for the nation, and he was really trying to tie everyone together. Now, this tying everyone together, he really did try it in a formal way, and this is called the Panglong Conference. And out of the Panglong Conference, actually, he secured kind of agreements and treaties and all that with some of the major ethnic minorities in Burma. But the sad story about Burma is that Aung San got assassinated, and with his assassination, this whole Panglong agreement just kind of collapsed because much of this Panglong agreement was really built in the trust in Aung San, and now that Aung San is removed from the scene, the minority groups and their leaders didn't have that same sense of trust with the later leaders like U Nu and Ne Win, and I think that sense of mistrust or suspicion is proved to be valid to a good degree lah, because of what happens later on with U Nu and Ne Win's regime. So very quickly, Burma gets independence in 1948. In 1948 itself, by 1949, most of these groups are either trying to distance themselves from the Burmese capital, or they have already engaged in armed hostilities. So the situation is quite bad, like from the point of 1948, 1949 itself, which is why you can have the Karen group of people who have been in the longest civil war in the entire world, and it all starts here, like right from the point of independence. That is the colonial legacy. Subsequently, government policy served to reinforce the divide and serve to really escalate the tensions. Now, keep in mind that I'm not in my presentation here for U Nu and Ne Win, I'm not saying that assimilation automatically equals negative outcomes. But the way that U Nu and the way that Ne Win implemented assimilation, I think it was very problematic, and it was very confrontational. So that kind of attitude in the implementation was, I think, for me, the deciding factor lah. So you can look across Southeast Asia, and there are other governments that did assimilation well. So for me, theory is theory, but sometimes you really got to see historically how was it implemented by each of the governments that you are assessing. So for U Nu, it was a assimilationist style approach, a lot of Burmanization policies. So again, based on the Burmese majority group of people, they nationalized education, so they really controlled it and set a benchmark, right, as Burman culture, language, and traditions. In 1961, Buddhism set as the state religion. Some of the minority groups out there, they are Christian. So, that there are those kind of clashes, and there's that kind of discrimination or segregation. So among the religious groups in Burma, the dominant ones are Buddhism. So here with 89% of sorts, and then the rest of them are like in the minority. But quite parallel to what you saw with the ethnicity, here you can see that there is a clear dominant religious group, a practicing faith in Burma. Now, I want to throw you back to a question that I had in last tutorial, which is, does assimilation have a justification? Okay, does assimilation have a justification? Is there a reason why UNU and Ne Win implemented assimilationist style policies? Going by the earlier chart on ethnicity and now going by the religious chart on religion, ask yourself that question again and find your own answer. Was there a context for assimilation? I'm not judging its effectiveness, but I'm asking, was there a context for assimilation? So the UNU policies and assimilation, it just kept getting more and more, and it's really quite institutionalized. It affected all aspects of society. His political ideology or his national ideology was this thing called Buddhism socialism. So you can see the kind of cultural elements over there, and it really imposed the dominant group characteristics on the minorities. So there's a lot of discrimination, there's a lot of imposition that is going around, and there are a lot of public statements about what it is to be a member of this nation, what it is to be a citizen of this nation. A lot of cultural characteristics are attached to the idea of citizen in Burma, back then. One of you in tutorials, it was Isabel, she brought up this really great point about the in national unity calculations, we must think of the majority group as well. So sometimes under UNU's rule, he would try some accommodation with the minority groups, but it always provoked some sort of reaction from the majority group. And of course, as a politician, like, who are you going to side more with? I mean, in UNU's case, he then just regressed on the minority policies and just kind of like went back to what the majority wanted lah, in that sense. So in national unity calculations, it's a good idea to think about the majority population's attitudes towards the policies as well. So of course, if you are a minority and kind of like you're facing the brunt of all these things, you're definitely going to be pissed off, and definitely you're going to organize some sort of a resistance or opposition and all that kind of stuff. So civil unrest began quite fast, and it was quite extensive, it was quite severe, it was quite violent, it was quite confrontational. And this this third point over here, fan the demands for federalism and minority autonomy. This sounds damn chim, but basically it means that they wanted to separate. Federalism means to say that they can remain within the country, but they need to have a lot of independence for themselves. They need to be able to make their own provincial decisions or their own state level decisions. They wouldn't necessarily be completely dominated by the Burmese government in the capital. So the US is a federal system, right? Like right now, USA, their federal system. Many of the states can decide things for themselves. They don't always have to listen to Washington. So that is the kind of system that some minorities are pushing for in Burma back then. But then there are the more extreme ones, the last point over there, they are calling entirely for separatism. They just want to break away from the country and form their own nation. And it all starts here like in the 1960s. When Ne Win comes in, you guys know what Ne Win is like, what kind of rule he had. It was an outright military dictatorship, right, from Ne Win and his government. So the kind of approach that he had in politics kind of transferred over to the social side as well. It was not just assimilationist, but I think that it was assimilationist to an even higher degree. Because of what was happening in politics, he really wanted that sense of control. The military was really centralizing their power. So any forms of opposition would really be stamped out. And a lot of it will really be kind of like marshaled and contained or just extinguished. So in all aspects of society, you have that education, mass media, language, curriculum. So all that kind of aspects, like what you saw in Singapore just now, all the integrationist stuff. Over here, it's all the assimilationist stuff. It goes on. You can see kind of their national ideology, the Burmese way to socialism. Quite like what you saw just now with Buddhism socialism. So it's quite the same kind of stuff lah, with regards to national ideology, the kind of spirit that they're doing it in, things like that. And of course, being a military government, they're not shy to use force. So violence begets violence. You use more violence against the minority groups, they get even more pissed off. They organize themselves into larger militias and they fight back. The government is not happy, they send in more army, fight back again. The militias are not happy, they start to form armies. So it becomes a warlord system. It's like China back in the good old days, like the dynasties and all that stuff. Yeah, clearly I don't know anything about Chinese history, but it's like a warlord system in Burma. So many and it exists like even till now. Many of the states are kind of like running themselves, even though it's not exactly legal or like formal or whatever, but it's just that their armies are just so strong. The minority armies, they're just so strong that kind of like the Burmese army itself, for all that it is, right, doesn't really want to be too confrontational to them also, that kind of stuff. So yeah, basically it's just an escalating situation and it sucks lah for Burma as a country. There's a lot of economic disparities, like just now what I mentioned with the center periphery divides. It adds fuel to the fire because not only do you face cultural erosion, but in terms of economics, your daily bread and butter, like the money in your pocket, the food in your bellies, that kind of stuff, it is really really imbalanced lah over there. And just kind of goes on all the way until the 1980s. So in 1988, like what I mentioned in the political lectures beforehand, 1988 there was a reaction against Ne Win's government, the 1988 revolutions or the 8888 revolutions. So it was around that point in time where there seemingly was a shift in Burmese politics, and there seemingly was a change in the tone of government. So in politics, they kind of allowed for greater space. That's where Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy could run in elections and things like that. So seemingly, it was an open space, or an opening space. And this was parallel in the social side as well, because here you can see that there were incentives being offered to the minority groups. Sometimes something like treaties lah, or like quid pro quo kind of situations where you let's cease fire and you get some stuff in return. You may get monetary reward, or you may just get like material whatever, or as something as simple as we will pardon you for your years of violence and stuff like that. So in the year 2000, 17 insurgent groups actually accepted this peace deal, which to me is a milestone lah for Burmese social relations and national unity. However, I don't think it's the end story, and you guys don't really need to know this, but this 17 groups, yeah, it's a good number, right? And I think it's credible. But the major ethnic groups, the major minority groups that were in rebellion did not commit to this. So that's why a lot of the insurgency that was major is still going on till today. So it's a mixed bag lah of successes, I would say. So at the end of the day, when you look at Burma right now, kind of like there's a stability, I feel, in the center. There's a stability with the Burmese dominated areas, but in the periphery of the country, especially in the border areas, a lot of the system is like a warlord system where most of them are self-governing, and I think in terms of the national unity indicators, right, you might want to think about that and how it reflects on the levels of success or effectiveness over there in Burma. So guys, this is it for today. We've looked at Singapore, we looked at Burma, we looked at two ends of the spectrum. I have asked you all some questions here in Singapore, for Singapore and Burma, so I'll follow up with that during the tutorials itself. But in tutorials itself, there's no question for the tutorials itself because we're still going through case studies. So on that note, I want you guys to look, today I've presented two ends of the spectrum. So they are on opposite ends. Now I want to go into the gray areas of the spectrum. And I suspect that I'll have differing opinions on these next two case studies that I want you to research more on. And I want you to bring the research to class, and then we'll have a discussion on them. So with the research, you can use your notes, you can use the supplement material and so on and so forth. I've printed hard copy for you already, but you can access the soft copy as well. So either way, and we will discuss them in tutorials. Now the two case studies. Number one, I want you guys to find out more about what happened in Thailand. You can use my slides as a model for how you approach case studies. So number one, I want you guys to look out for Thailand. Number two, I want you guys to look out for Philippines. So in tutorials, we will discuss any outstanding questions for Singapore and Burma, but heavily concentrated, we are going to look at the case studies of Thailand and Philippines. So do a bit of research on that and then bring it to class with discussions, some student presenters as well. Okay, so thanks guys. That's all from me today. Wish you guys well. DJ Anesh out.